We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. The scorching Qatar sun beat down on Major Blake Long's neck as he stood at attention in the sweltering heat of Al Udeid Air Base. Beads of sweat trickled down his spine beneath his combat uniform, but 8 months of deployment had taught him to remain stoic despite the discomfort. Colonel Matthews' voice carried across the assembly area, delivering the final briefing before their return stateside. Remember, gentlemen, readjustment to civilian life takes time. The colonel's weathered voice resonated with authority. The support services we discussed are there for a reason. Use them. Blake's mind drifted to Dawn, his wife of 5 years. Their last video call had been brief, something about a busy shift at the hospital. Her auburn hair had been pulled back in a hasty ponytail, dark circles under her eyes suggesting long hours at work. She'd seemed distracted, distant even, but he'd attributed it to the poor connection and time difference. 2 weeks before his deployment, they'd tried to reconnect intimately, but the moment had ended in frustrated silence. Dawn had pulled away, muttering something about an early morning shift, leaving Blake staring at the ceiling until dawn. Major Long? Colonel Matthews' voice snapped him back to attention. Yes, sir. Your transport leaves in 30. Dismissed. As the formation dispersed, Captain Wes Acevedo fell into step beside Blake. They'd flown countless missions together, their friendship forged in the crucible of combat, and countless hours in the cockpit. Finally heading home, brother, Wes clapped him on the shoulder, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Dawn's probably got something special planned for your return. Blake noticed the slight hesitation in Wes's voice, a barely perceptible pause that seemed out of place. Everything okay? Wes adjusted his cap, squinting against the sun. Yeah, just Alexandra mentioned something about running into Dawn at the hospital. Said she seemed pretty wrapped up in work lately. Different department? Different department? Blake frowned. She hasn't mentioned any transfer. Probably nothing. Wes shrugged, but his expression remained guarded. You know how hospitals work. Staff gets moved around all the time. The process of departure was a blur of equipment checks, paperwork, and security protocols. Blake found himself in his assigned seat on the transport, staring at his phone's wallpaper, a photo of Dawn from their last anniversary dinner. Her smile seemed different now, or maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks after months apart. You're awful quiet, Wes observed from the seat next to him, his voice barely audible over the aircraft's engines. Blake leaned back, closing his eyes, just thinking about how things were before deployment. Dawn and we weren't in the best place. How do you mean? Extra shifts at the hospital, late nights, canceled dinner plans. I tried talking to her about it, but she said I was being paranoid. The week before deployment, I barely saw her. When I did, she was always on her phone or talking about some new project at work. The flight seemed to stretch endlessly. Blake dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with fragments of memories. Dawn's distant expression during their last intimate moment, the way she'd avoided his eyes at the airport, the increasingly brief video calls during deployment. A bout of turbulence jolted him awake. Wes was watching him with concern. You were talking in your sleep, his friend said quietly. What did I say? Something about timing not making sense. Wes hesitated, then shook his head. Never mind. We're almost home. As the aircraft touched down on Charleston soil, Blake's phone buzzed with a message. His sister Colleen's name appeared on the screen, picking you up instead of Dawn. She's not feeling well. Don't worry. Everything's fine. The knot in his stomach tightened as he gathered his belongings. Outside the window, Charleston's familiar landscape spread before him, unchanged yet somehow different, like a photograph that had been subtly altered while he was away. Colleen Harvey's silver SUV idled in the pickup lane, her pharmacist's white coat visible through the windshield. As Blake approached, he noticed her drumming fingers on the steering wheel, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Her usual bright smile seemed forced as she stepped out to embrace him. Welcome home, little brother, she said, holding him perhaps a little too tight. How was the flight? Long, Blake replied, studying her face. What's really going on with Dawn? Colleen busied herself with his duffel bag, avoiding direct eye contact. She's been under the weather lately. Morning sickness, she says. She paused, giving him a significant look that made his blood run cold. She's been staying home the past few days. The drive home was filled with Colleen's careful small talk, each word seeming calculated. Blake noticed how she kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, as if gauging his reactions. The hospital's been busy, he prompted, remembering Wes's comment about department changes. I wouldn't know, Colleen replied, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Dawn's schedule changed a few months ago. We don't cross paths as much anymore. Change how? She switched to a different unit. Something about professional development. Colleen's voice carried an edge he couldn't quite place. There was a new pharmaceutical rep, Glenn somebody, who helped facilitate the transfer. The name hit Blake like a physical blow. Glenn Brandt, Dawn's college boyfriend. The one she claimed was ancient history when Blake had noticed his name on the hospital's new hire list 6 months ago. Glenn Brandt? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. Colleen's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Blake, I just drive, Colleen. Their suburban Charleston neighborhood looked peaceful in the afternoon sun. American flags fluttering from front porches, children's bikes scattered across manicured lawns. Everything normal. Everything exactly as he'd left it. Except it wasn't. Their two-story colonial came into view, Dawn's red Audi parked in the driveway. Shopping bags were visible through the car's windows. High-end brands he recognized from European boutiques. When did she go to Europe? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colleen put the SUV in park, turning to face him. There was a nursing conference about 2 months ago. Paris, I think. She reached for his hand. Blake, maybe I should come in with you. No, he said firmly, gathering his bags. I need to do this alone. The front door was unlocked. The house smelled different. New candles, perhaps, or air freshener. Evidence of recent cleaning was everywhere. Vacuumed carpets, dusted surfaces, fresh flowers in vases. Dawn, he called out, his voice echoing in the foyer. Footsteps above. Then his wife appeared at the top of the stairs. She looked radiant, her auburn hair falling in soft waves, wearing a new dress he didn't recognize. For a moment, she froze, one hand on the banister, the other unconsciously moving to her abdomen. Blake, she exclaimed, descending the stairs quickly. I'm so sorry I couldn't pick you up. I've been so sick, and she threw herself into his arms. But something was off about the embrace. Her body felt different, tenser, and she pulled back too quickly. The bedroom's full of shopping bags, he observed, keeping his tone casual. Successful trip to Europe? Oh, that, she laughed nervously. Just a few things I picked up at the conference. Professional wear, mostly. She tugged at his hand. Come upstairs. I have news. The master bedroom was indeed littered with shopping bags, price tags still attached to items that were definitely not professional wear. A lacy negligee peeked out of one bag, a designer sundress from another. Sit down, honey. Dawn patted the bed beside her. I know this might come as a shock, but she took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with her dress. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Blake's face remained impassive as his mind calculated dates, times, possibilities. How far along? He asked quietly. 12 weeks, Dawn replied quickly. Too quickly. Dr. Burton's been monitoring everything. She says it's perfectly normal for the timing to be a bit unusual. Their last intimate moment flashed through his mind. That awkward, failed attempt 2 weeks before deployment. The math was irrefutable. Unusual, Blake repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. That's an interesting word for it. Dawn jumped up, rushing to her dresser. I knew you'd be skeptical. But look. She pulled out a thick medical file. Dr. Burton has documented everything. These things can happen, Blake. It's a miracle. He took the file mechanically, noting the hospital letterhead, Dr. Beth Burton's signature. The same Dr. Burton who had landed her position shortly after Glenn Brandt joined the hospital board. A miracle, he echoed, setting the file aside. Like Glenn Brandt transferring to Charleston? Like your sudden unit transfer? Like your solo trip to Europe? Dawn's face paled, but she pressed on. Don't be ridiculous. Glenn has nothing to do with this. He's just a colleague who helped you change units? Who sits on the board with Dr. Burton? Blake stood, his composure still intact, but his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. A colleague who happened to be in Paris at the same time as your conference? How did you? Dawn caught herself, panic flashing across her face. You've been talking to people? Getting information behind my back. Interesting that your mind went there, Blake replied. I just asked a question. You're the one who seems to know about Glenn's travel schedule. Dawn's composure cracked. It's not what you think. The timing is impossible, Blake finished. Physically, biologically impossible. He moved toward the door, unable to stay in the room any longer. We both know that. Blake, please. Dawn's voice cracked. Let me explain. But he was already halfway down the stairs, needing space, needing air. Behind him, Dawn's sobs echoed through the house they'd once shared, where they'd built a life he now realized had been founded on lies. Blake stepped outside. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Colleen checking on him, or Wes offering support. But right now he couldn't talk to anyone. He needed to think, to process the impossible reality he'd just walked into. Dawn appeared in the doorway behind him, her voice small and broken. Blake, please, come back inside. We can talk about this. Dr. Burton can explain everything. He turned to face her one last time, seeing not the woman he'd married, but a stranger wearing his wife's face. No amount of medical documentation can change basic biology, Dawn. We both know that. With those words, he walked away from their home, leaving behind not just his wife, but the life he'd thought he was coming home to. The truth of her betrayal would have consequences, but those would come later. For now, there was only the reality of this moment, his world turning upside down on what should have been a joyful homecoming. Behind him, Dawn's voice called out one last time, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But Blake kept walking, his military bearing the only thing keeping him upright as the sun set on the life he'd known and trusted, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another he never wanted to write. The morning sun filtered through Colleen's guest room blinds as Blake completed his 100th push-up. Exercise had become his refuge in the week since discovering Dawn's betrayal. Each repetition helped quiet the chaos in his mind, if only momentarily. The physical discipline helps, Chaplain Rodriguez had told him during their morning meeting at the base chapel. But don't use it to avoid processing your emotions, son. That pain needs somewhere to go. The chaplain's daily counseling sessions had become Blake's anchor, a way to maintain composure without completely shutting down. Today's session had focused on accepting help from others, which made the timing of Patrick Stevens' arrival feel almost providential. A gentle knock interrupted his cool-down routine. Blake? Colleen's voice carried through the door. Patrick's here? Patrick Stevens sat at Colleen's kitchen table, his laptop open and his demeanor reflecting their Air Force Academy days. Focused, methodical, precise. He'd traded his military career for private investigation work 3 years ago, but his approach remained distinctly tactical. Walk me through the timeline, Patrick said, pushing a cup of coffee across the table. Everything you know for certain. Blake drew a deep breath, centering himself, as Chaplain Rodriguez had taught him. Glenn Brandt transferred to Charleston General 6 months ago. Dawn's unit transfer followed 3 weeks later. 2 months ago, she went to Paris for what she claimed was a nursing conference. Patrick's fingers moved across his keyboard. Let's start with the conference. According to hospital records, 3 nurses attended: Maria Santos, James Chun, and Patricia Wright. He turned the laptop around. Dawn's name isn't on the list because she wasn't there, at least not officially. What do you mean, not officially? Colleen asked, setting down her coffee. She took personal leave, Patrick explained, pulling up another document. But look at these credit card statements. She was in Paris, all right, just not for professional development. The evidence unfolded with devastating clarity. While Blake had been flying missions in Qatar, Dawn had been staying at the Ritz-Carlton Paris, charging romantic dinners and boutique shopping sprees to her credit card. The dates aligned perfectly with the European Medical Tourism Conference, where Glenn Brandt had been representing his pharmaceutical company. There's more, Patrick said quietly. Glenn's transfer wasn't a coincidence. He requested the position specifically, citing the hospital's potential participation in his company's new drug trials. The application was submitted 3 months before your deployment was even announced. Blake's hands tightened around his coffee cup. They planned this? Keep going, Colleen urged, her pharmacist training evident in her focused attention. Patrick pulled up more documents. Dawn's unit transfer put her directly in charge of patient recruitment for Glenn's pharmaceutical trials. Dr. Beth Burton signed off on both the transfer and the trial protocols. The timing windows in these protocols, Colleen leaned in, frowning. They're unusually flexible, almost as if they're designed to accommodate date adjustments, Patrick finished. Dr. Burton has approved similar flexible protocols for 3 other trials under Glenn's supervision. The implications hit Blake like a physical blow. The pregnancy timeline documentation. Part of a pattern, Patrick confirmed. Dr. Burton has been helping Glenn manipulate trial data for months. Dawn's situation is just another example of their documentation tricks. Blake stood, needing to move. What about before the transfer? Before my deployment? Patrick pulled up phone records. Dawn's communications with Glenn increased significantly 2 months before his transfer. The calls always coincided with her late shifts at the hospital. Those shifts, Colleen interjected. I thought it was strange. I rarely saw her there when I worked late. Because she wasn't there, Patrick confirmed, displaying badge access records. She'd leave shortly after her shift started. There's a coffee shop 3 blocks away where Glenn regularly reported client meetings on the same evenings. Blake remembered those nights, coming home to an empty house, accepting Dawn's explanations about staffing shortages and emergency cases. Each memory now tainted by the knowledge of her deception. The Europe trip is our strongest evidence, Patrick continued. She used military spouse benefits for the airfare. The Family Support Center's travel assistance program. She used my deployment to fund her affair. Blake's voice was hollow. Chaplain Rodriguez's words from that morning echoed in his mind. Anger is natural, son. But don't let it consume you. Channel it into action. What's our next step? Blake asked, falling back on his training. Patrick closed his laptop carefully. We need to understand the full scope of Dr. Burton's involvement. This goes beyond Dawn's timeline manipulation. There's a pattern of ethical violations in Glenn's drug trials that we're just beginning to uncover. As if on cue, Patrick's phone buzzed. One of the nurses from Dr. Burton's department is willing to talk. She's noticed irregularities in the trial documentation. The investigation was taking shape, each piece of evidence revealing new layers of deception. Blake thought about Dawn's face when she presented those medical records, her desperate insistence that these things can happen. One step at a time, he muttered, echoing Chaplain Rodriguez's daily reminder. The chaplain had warned him about the temptation to rush ahead, to let anger drive his actions. This needed to be handled carefully, methodically. The morning sun had climbed higher, Charleston's humidity beginning to press against the windows. But inside Colleen's kitchen, the air felt sharp with purpose. The truth was emerging one document at a time. Charleston General Hospital rose against the morning sky, its windows reflecting the harbor's distant waters. From his discreet position in the parking structure, Patrick observed Dr. Beth Burton's 4th-floor office, the same office her predecessor had occupied for 20 years before his surprisingly abrupt retirement. Another pharmaceutical rep just went in, Patrick reported quietly into his phone. 3rd one this week, all from different divisions of Glenn's company. Blake, reviewing documents at Colleen's house, studied the image Patrick sent. Same parent corporation that donated to the hospital board? Exactly, Patrick confirmed. The donation that coincidentally preceded the previous department head's retirement and Dr. Burton's appointment. The investigation had revealed a network smaller than initially feared, but more intricately connected. Each player had a specific role, their actions carefully orchestrated to maintain the facade. A knock at Colleen's door interrupted their discussion. Blake opened it to find Tricia Wilkerson, their neighbor, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible distress. I need to talk to you, she said, wringing her hands. About Dawn, about what I've seen. Blake led her to the living room, where Patrick sat quietly in the corner, his phone set to record. Tricia perched on the edge of the sofa, her composure cracking. I covered for her sometimes, she admitted, words tumbling out. When you'd call looking for her during those late shifts. I thought I thought I was being a good friend. She said she was working extra hours, attending staff meetings. What changed? Blake asked quietly. Trisha's hands twisted in her lap. Last month, I had to take Emma for her checkup. I saw them in the parking garage, Dawn and Glenn. The way they were together, she shook her head. Then I started noticing things. The shopping bags she claimed were from the nursing conference. But my cousin attended that conference and Dawn wasn't there. Did you confront her? Patrick asked from his corner. 2 weeks ago, Trisha nodded. She broke down, admitted to the affair. Said Dr. Burton was helping them with medical records to make the timing work. She begged me not to tell anyone. Why come forward now? Because it's wrong. Trisha's voice cracked. Not just the affair, that's horrible enough. But using your deployment as cover? Manipulating medical records? My husband served. The thought of someone abusing military family support this way. Patrick leaned forward slightly. What exactly did Dawn say about Dr. Burton's involvement? That she owed Glenn for helping her get the position. She's been signing off on paperwork for him. Not just Dawn's dates, but something about his trial results too. Dawn seemed scared when she mentioned it, like she'd said too much. The pieces aligned with Patrick's investigation. Dr. Burton's cooperation wasn't just about one fake timeline. It was part of a systematic manipulation of medical data. The nurses are afraid to speak up, Trisha continued. Dr. Burton has the board's support through Glenn. But they talk. They've noticed patterns in how dates and data get adjusted. After Trisha left, Patrick played back the recording. This confirms our suspicions about the connection between Dawn's timeline and the trial data manipulation. Does Dawn understand what she's involved in? Blake asked. Beyond her own deception? I don't think so, Patrick replied. She's focused on maintaining her pregnancy story. But Glenn and Dr. Burton, they're using Dawn's situation to ensure mutual silence about the broader ethical violations. The network was becoming clearer. Dr. Burton's position secured through Glenn's influence. The pattern of falsified records. Dawn's desperate clinging to the medical documentation's validity. Each strand connected to the others, forming a web of coordinated deception. We need to move carefully, Patrick advised. Document everything. One wrong step could alert them and make evidence disappear. Blake nodded, remembering Chaplain Rodriguez's counsel about patience and precision. The truth would emerge, but it had to be handled methodically. The dinner party at Wes and Alexandra's home was meant to be a small gathering of close friends, a way to help Blake maintain some normalcy while the investigation continued. Alexandra had carefully selected guests from outside the hospital's political sphere, creating what should have been a safe space. I had no idea the Hendersons would bring him, Alexandra whispered to Wes, watching the scene unfold at their front door. They're new to the hospital board. They don't know about. Her words trailed off as Glenn Brandt stepped into their foyer, a gift-wrapped package tucked under his arm. The confident smile he usually wore at hospital functions faltered as he spotted Blake across the room. The package, a baby book with a handwritten note partially visible through torn wrapping, disappeared quickly behind his back, but not before Blake saw it. Time seemed to freeze. The casual conversations around them faded to white noise as Blake processed the scene. Glenn's presence was bad enough, but the baby book, that level of audacity cut through every defense Blake had built. Excuse me, he managed, his voice tight. His hands trembled as he stepped into Wes's garage, the only private space available. The garage door opened behind him. Wes slipped in, positioning himself between Blake and the door, standing guard just as he had on countless missions. Glenn's leaving, Wes reported quietly. Alexandra told the Hendersons there must have been a misunderstanding about the guest list. She's handling it. Blake barely heard him. The sight of that baby book, the handwritten note, it was all too much. For the first time since discovering Dawn's betrayal, since beginning this investigation, his composure completely shattered. I've got you, brother, Wes said simply, maintaining his position at the door while Blake finally allowed himself to break down. The tears came suddenly, years of military stoicism giving way to raw pain. Every piece of evidence they'd uncovered, every layer of deception revealed, it all crashed over him at once. 8 months, Blake choked out. 8 months I was serving my country while she... Let it out, Wes encouraged quietly. You've been holding this together too long. In the distance, they could hear Alexandra smoothly managing the awkward situation, her years of nursing experience evident in how she handled the social dynamics. The other guests, unaware of the full situation, carried on with their evening. The book, Blake managed between harsh breaths. He brought a baby book to a dinner party. Like it's normal, because they've convinced themselves it is, Wes replied. They've built this whole story in their heads where their actions make sense, where medical records can change reality. Blake's breakdown lasted several minutes, each sob releasing months of pent-up pain and betrayal. Wes maintained his vigil, offering silent support until Blake's breathing steadied. You don't have to go back in there, Wes offered. Alexandra can make your excuses. No, Blake straightened, wiping his face. I'm done letting them control the narrative. Done letting them think their lies can become truth through enough documentation. Together, they returned to the party. Alexandra had already smoothed over Glenn's abrupt departure, her professional experience evident in how she'd managed the situation. The other guests, innocent of the full context, continued their conversations. But something had fundamentally changed. The breaking point had passed, leaving behind a clarity that no amount of falsified medical records could obscure. The truth was undeniable now, not just about Dawn's betrayal, but about the entire network of deception they'd uncovered. Blake accepted a fresh drink from Alexandra, noting the concern in her eyes. The investigation would continue, evidence would be gathered, and truth would prevail. But for now, surrounded by true friends, he allowed himself to simply feel the relief of no longer carrying this burden alone. Maurice Krause's corner office overlooked Charleston Harbor, spring magnolias swaying in the morning breeze outside his window. The military lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, studying the evidence chronologically arranged across his mahogany conference table. Your emotional response matters as much as the evidence, Maurice began, his tone gentler than most would expect from a military attorney. Chaplain Rodriguez's reports show you've been processing this trauma appropriately, seeking help instead of reacting rashly. That speaks volumes about your character. Blake sat across from him, the past month's weight visible in the new lines around his eyes. Colleen had accompanied him to the meeting, her presence a steady reminder of family support. Tell me what you're feeling, Maurice prompted, setting aside the documents. Not what you think you should feel. What you actually feel. Blake's hands clenched briefly. Rage. Betrayal. But mostly, he paused, gathering thoughts. Mostly I feel violated. Not just personally. They corrupted everything. Military family support, medical ethics, even basic human trust. Colleen reached over, squeezing his hand. That's what the chaplain's been helping you process, right? Daily sessions. Blake nodded. He says acknowledging the anger is healthy, but channeling it constructively is crucial. Maurice made notes, his pen scratching softly. This emotional groundwork strengthens our position. You're not seeking revenge. You're standing up for institutional integrity. That's a crucial distinction. He stood, moving to a whiteboard divided into 3 sections: personal, military, and medical. Under each, he began mapping connections. The personal betrayal is obvious, he explained, writing. The affair, the pregnancy deception. But here's where it escalates. They used military family support systems to facilitate their relationship. Travel assistance meant for deployed service members' families, exploited for their Paris rendezvous. The medical ethics violations are even more extensive, Colleen added, her pharmacist's expertise evident. Dr. Burton's falsified records go beyond Dawn's pregnancy timeline. She's been manipulating drug trial data for Glenn's company. Maurice nodded, adding details to the medical section. Each strand connects to the others. Glenn's influence got Dr. Burton her position. She repaid him by falsifying trial data. Dawn's pregnancy timeline was just another favor in their web of deception. When do we confront her? Blake asked. Sunday morning, Maurice replied, checking his calendar. People are typically clearest-headed then, more receptive to reality. We'll present everything methodically. Start with the military family support abuse, then layer in the medical fraud. He turned from the whiteboard, his expression serious. This isn't just about exposing infidelity. We're revealing systematic abuse of programs meant to support military families and protect patient safety. That's why your emotional stability is crucial. It shows this isn't about revenge, but accountability. Blake thought about the base chaplain's words from their morning session. Righteous anger has its place, but it must serve justice, not vengeance. What should I expect? He asked. Maurice sat back down, spreading out the evidence in presentation order. First, she'll deny. Then, as we present each piece of evidence, she'll try to explain it away. The credit card statements, the leave requests, the falsified medical records. She'll have rehearsed explanations for everything. And when those fail? Colleen asked. That's when the truth typically emerges, Maurice replied. Once she realizes the extent of our evidence, including Trisha's statement and the pharmaceutical trial documentation, she'll probably break down. That's our moment to get the full story. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing every document, practicing responses to potential denials, preparing for every scenario. Morris's military background showed in his tactical approach, treating each piece of evidence like intelligence in a carefully planned operation. Remember, he said as they concluded, stay focused on the institutional violations. The personal betrayal hurts the most, but the systematic abuse of military and medical systems. That's what demands accountability. Colleen gathered her notes, her pharmacist's precision evident in her organized documentation. I'll have the hospital board records ready, showing the timeline of Glenn's influence and Dr. Burton's appointment. Good, Maurice nodded. Blake, spend tomorrow with Chaplain Rodriguez. Center yourself. Sunday morning, we'll meet here first, then proceed to your house. Wes and Alexandra will be on standby for support afterward. Blake stood, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation, but also a strange sense of peace. The truth would finally be faced, not just about his marriage, but about the entire network of corruption it had revealed. One last thing, Maurice added as they prepared to leave. Remember what Chaplain Rodriguez told you. This isn't just about exposing their deception. It's about defending the integrity of systems meant to protect others. That purpose will sustain you through whatever comes next. Sunday morning arrived with Charleston's characteristic blend of sunshine and sea breeze. Dawn sat at their kitchen table, morning light across her face as Blake methodically arranged documents before her. Wes and Alexandra waited discreetly outside, while Maurice observed from the living room, close enough to intervene if needed. What is all this? Dawn's voice wavered, her hands cradling her coffee cup like a shield. Blake placed the first document down, military family support travel assistance paperwork. Let's start with Paris. Interesting use of deployment support resources, don't you think? Dawn's fingers tightened around her cup. I can explain? Please do. Blake's voice remained steady as he added credit card statements. Explain the Ritz-Carlton, the private dining rooms at Michelin-starred restaurants, the boutique shopping sprees, all while I was flying combat missions. It wasn't, she began, but Blake continued laying out evidence. Personal leave, not professional development. He placed the hospital documentation next. No nursing conference, just a romantic getaway with Glenn, funded partly by military family support programs. Color drained from Dawn's face. How did you? Credit card records, hotel bills, restaurant receipts. Each piece of evidence joined the others. But that's just the beginning. Let's discuss Dr. Burton's role. Leave Beth out of this. Dawn's voice sharpened with sudden fear. Like you left her out of the pharmaceutical trial manipulations? Blake's tone remained measured. The same Dr. Burton who got her position through Glenn's influence? Who's been falsifying trial data in exchange for helping cover up your affair? Tears began sliding down Dawn's cheeks. You don't understand. Help me understand then. Blake leaned forward. Help me understand how you justified using support systems meant for military families. How you rationalized involving Dr. Burton in medical ethics violations. Dawn's composure fractured. I was lonely. 8 months, Blake. 8 months alone while I served our country, he finished. The country whose support systems you exploited for your affair? It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered. Glenn was just, he understood. Understood what? how to manipulate medical ethics, how to abuse military family support programs. For the first time, Blake's control wavered. I could almost understand the affair, Dawn. Deployments are hard. Loneliness is real. But this elaborate deception? Trying to trap me into raising another man's child while I was serving overseas. Paris was a mistake, she whispered. We got carried away. The weekend that resulted in your pregnancy, Blake stated flatly. The weekend Dr. Burton helped you pretend never happened, just like she's been helping Glenn hide pharmaceutical trial irregularities. Dawn's facade crumbled completely. She owed him, she sobbed. Her position, the trial data, everything's connected. I wanted to believe we could make it work. By lying? By falsifying medical records? By abusing systems meant to help military families? Glenn said it would work. Dawn's voice rose hysterically. Dr. Burton had done it before, adjusting data, making documentation match what we needed. Her confession tumbled out between sobs. The calculated deception, the weekend in Paris, Dr. Burton's deal to help in exchange for silence about the pharmaceutical trials. Each revelation confirmed what their investigation had uncovered. Maurice stepped in from the living room, his presence a reminder of the larger implications. Dawn's eyes widened as she realized the full scope of what she'd admitted. A lot of people are going to have questions, Maurice said quietly. The Military Family Support Office, the hospital board, the Medical Ethics Committee. Dawn's hands shook as she reached for the documents. Glenn, what will happen to... That's not your concern anymore. Blake cut her off. The truth is coming out. All of it. The affair, the timeline fraud, the ethical violations. No more deception. The morning sun climbed higher as Dawn's carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Outside, Wes and Alexandra waited, ready to support their friend through the aftermath of this necessary confrontation. The ripples of truth spread through Charleston's medical community over the next 3 months. The hospital board launched an ethics investigation, uncovering patterns of irregularities in Dr. Burton's documentation that extended far beyond Dawn's pregnancy timeline. It's worse than we thought, Alexander confided to Blake over coffee in late spring. The investigation found systematic manipulation of pharmaceutical trial data. Dr. Burton's been falsifying results for Glenn's company for years. The medical board acted swiftly, suspending Dr. Burton's license pending a full investigation. Glenn's pharmaceutical company, facing potential scandals, transferred him to their Seattle office. Dawn, her deception exposed and her Charleston life in shambles, chose to follow him west. Blake found unexpected support throughout the divorce proceedings, which stretched through the summer. Base housing gossip ran rampant, but Wes and Alexandra's steadfast loyalty provided shelter from the worst of it. People talk, Wes observed one evening at their regular dinner gathering, but they're talking about Dawn's betrayal of military family values, not about you. Chaplain Rodriguez's continued guidance helped Blake process not just the personal betrayal, but its broader implications. Their daily sessions moved from crisis management to deeper healing. You stood for something larger than yourself, the chaplain reminded him during an early fall meeting. You defended the integrity of systems meant to help others. That's no small thing. As Charleston's humid summer gave way to milder autumn days, Blake began rebuilding his life. A beachfront condo provided physical distance from the memories, while new routines helped establish emotional boundaries. 6 months after the confrontation, Blake stood on his balcony, watching October sunset paint the harbor in autumn colors. His phone buzzed with a message from Colleen. Dawn's baby had been born in Seattle, the timing matching perfectly with the Paris trip rather than his deployment. The news brought a complex wave of emotions. Relief at the final vindication of truth, lingering anger at the attempted deception, but predominantly a sense of peace. His military career had taught him that missions rarely end as expected, but it's the response to unexpected outcomes that defines character. Heavy thoughts? Dr. Erica Brock asked, joining him at the railing. They'd met 3 months ago through the military counseling services, her specialized experience with service member trauma providing a unique understanding of his journey. Colleen texted. He showed her the message. Dawn's baby. Erica nodded, understanding the complexity of the moment. "How does it feel?" "Like closing a chapter," he replied, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the water. 8 months of combat deployment felt simpler than these past 6 months at home. "Because combat has clear enemies," she observed. "Betrayal by those we trust. That's a different kind of warfare." Blake thought about everything that had unfolded. The exposure of Dawn's affair, the revelation of medical ethics violations, the abuse of military support systems. Each thread of deception had led to necessary truth, painful but purifying. The hardest part, he admitted, wasn't the affair itself. It was discovering how deep the corruption went, how they used systems meant to help people to facilitate their deception. Erica nodded, her professional insight complementing her personal warmth. "That's why your response mattered so much. You didn't just expose a personal betrayal. You stood up for institutional integrity." The harbor lights began twinkling on, Charleston transitioning from day to evening. Somewhere across the country, Dawn and Glenn were starting their new life, away from the scandal their choices had created. Dr. Burton was facing the consequences of years of ethical violations, her medical career in jeopardy. But here, in this moment, Blake felt the solid ground of truth beneath his feet. His commitment to honor had guided him through his darkest deployment yet, not a battle fought in distant lands, but a war for integrity fought right at home. "Ready for dinner?" Erica asked softly, their weekly tradition of exploring Charleston's restaurants another step in building new patterns. Blake took a final look at the harbor, at the city that had witnessed both his deepest betrayal and his strongest resilience. Trust would take time to rebuild, but integrity that remained unshaken. "Ready," he smiled, turning from the view. The sun set on one chapter of his life, but the horizon promised new beginnings built on stronger foundations of truth and honor. His military career had taught him that some missions end unexpectedly, but it's how you handle the aftermath that defines you. As he followed Erica to the door, Blake knew he'd handled this one with the honor and integrity that had guided him through every other challenge in his life. Epilogue, 5 years later. The Charleston sunrise painted familiar golden streaks across the harbor as Lieutenant Colonel Blake Long stood on the balcony of his beachfront home, a different view from the same city where his life had unraveled 5 years ago. The promotion board had recognized his unwavering commitment to integrity, particularly during the aftermath of what became known as the Burton Brandt pharmaceutical scandal. "The coffee's ready," Erica called from inside. Their marriage of 3 years had grown from the ashes of betrayal, built on a foundation of honest communication and shared values. Dr. Erica Brocklong had expanded her practice, specializing in military family trauma and becoming a leading voice in reforming support systems to prevent exploitation. Blake's phone buzzed, a message from Colleen. His sister had become instrumental in revolutionizing pharmaceutical trial oversight at Charleston General after the scandal broke. Her message today, however, was personal. "Saw this morning's Seattle Times article. Thought you should know." The attached link led to a headline that would have once shattered him, but now barely rippled his peace. Former pharmaceutical executive faces federal charges in ongoing trial data fraud investigation. Glenn Brandt's carefully constructed world had begun unraveling shortly after his transfer to Seattle. The investigation into Dr. Burton's ethical violations had unleashed a cascade of revelations about pharmaceutical trial manipulation spanning multiple states. His company, initially hoping to contain the scandal with his transfer, had eventually turned on him to save their reputation. Dawn's fate had been equally stark, though different. Her nursing license had been suspended in 3 states after the extent of her involvement in the documentation fraud came to light. The last Colleen had heard, she was working as a medical office receptionist in a small Washington town, her relationship with Glenn having crumbled under the weight of their consequences. "Their son started kindergarten this year," Colleen's message continued. "She tried to contact me last month. Wanted to know if you'd ever consider." Blake didn't need to read further. Dawn's occasional attempts to seek forgiveness, to explain, had become increasingly desperate as her life deteriorated. The boy, conceived during that Paris weekend, would never know him, and that was for the best. "Everything okay?" Erica asked, joining him with coffee mugs in hand. Her intuition, honed by years of professional practice and personal understanding, caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. Glenn's facing federal charges. He showed her the article. The pharmaceutical trial fraud finally caught up with him. Erica skimmed the article, her professional experience adding context. The investigation started with Dr. Burton's medical license suspension, but it uncovered systematic fraud across multiple states. Dawn's pregnancy timeline manipulation was just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Beth Burton had faced the harshest professional consequences. Her medical license permanently revoked. She now taught high school biology in North Carolina, her career in medicine irreparably destroyed. The medical board's investigation had revealed decades of ethical violations, each one meticulously documented in service of pharmaceutical company interests. Was called yesterday, Blake mentioned, changing the subject. The squadron's organizing a 5-year reunion next month. Captain Wes Acevedo had remained Blake's closest friend, their bond strengthened by shared experience. He and Alexandra had been there through the darkest days, their unwavering support a testament to true friendship. Alexandra had risen to director of nursing at Charleston General, implementing strict ethical oversight protocols born from the lessons of the Burton Brandt scandal. Maurice might actually attend this one, Erica smiled, referring to the military lawyer who had become a close friend. Maurice Krause had used the case to advocate for stronger protections of military family support systems, leading to significant reforms in how such programs were monitored and protected. The morning sun climbed higher as Blake reflected on the 5 years since his world had shattered. Each player in the drama had reaped the consequences of their choices. Glenn and Dawn's attempt to build a new life in Seattle had collapsed under the weight of ongoing investigations and professional disgrace. Their son, innocent of his parents' choices, would grow up in the shadow of their scandal. Tricia Wilkerson had found redemption in honesty, her testimony crucial in exposing the broader ethical violations. She now worked with military family support services, helping identify and prevent similar exploitations. Her conscience, once burdened by unwitting complicity, had found peace in working to protect others. Chaplain Rodriguez had retired but still maintained contact, his wisdom having guided Blake through both the crisis and its aftermath. The chaplain's insights about channeling pain into purpose had proven prophetic. Blake now mentored young officers facing similar betrayals, helping them maintain their integrity through personal crises. "We should head in," Erica noted, checking her watch. "The adoption agency meeting is at 10. Blake smiled, remembering their decision to build their family through adoption, specifically choosing to work with military children in need of stable homes. Their first meeting with 7-year-old Emma, whose parents had both been lost in service, was scheduled for today. The choice felt right, transforming the pain of past betrayal into hope for a child's future. Emma's background as a military child added special meaning to their decision, a way of giving back to the community that had supported Blake through his darkest hours. Inside their home, photos told the story of rebuilding. Blake and Erica's wedding on the beach, surrounded by true friends. Colleen receiving recognition for her work in pharmaceutical oversight reform. Wes and Alexandra's twins' christening, where Blake stood as godfather. Each image represented a step forward, a conscious choice to build something better from the ashes of betrayal. Patrick sent his report, Erica mentioned, referring to Patrick Stevens, whose private investigation work had expanded into a specialized practice protecting military families from fraud. His initial investigation of Dawn's deception had evolved into a broader mission, his firm now working closely with military family support services to prevent similar exploitations. The report detailed the ongoing consequences faced by the principal players in the scandal. Glenn's pharmaceutical company had paid massive fines, but survived, implementing stringent ethical oversight to rebuild their reputation. Their new compliance officer, a retired military lawyer who understood the importance of institutional integrity. Dawn's attempts to rebuild her life in Seattle had yielded little success. Her nursing career destroyed, her relationship with Glenn poisoned by mutual recrimination. She had fallen into a pattern of temporary jobs and increasing bitterness. Their son, now 5, was the only stability in her life. a constant reminder of the choices that had led to her downfall. She tried to publish her story last year, Erica recalled. No publishers would touch it. The medical ethics violations made her toxic. Blake nodded, remembering Morris's words from 5 years ago. This isn't just about personal betrayal. It's about institutional integrity. The ripples of their actions had affected not just careers but entire systems, leading to reform protocols in both military family support and medical research oversight. The doorbell rang, Colleen arriving to accompany them to the adoption meeting. His sister's support had never wavered, her professional expertise helping expose the broader implications of the scandal, while her personal strength helped him rebuild. "Ready to meet Emma?" she asked, hugging them both. Her own life had flourished in the aftermath of the scandal, her role in reforming pharmaceutical oversight leading to a position on the state medical ethics board. Blake took Erica's hand, feeling the solid gold of her wedding ring, so different from the marriage it had replaced. This relationship was built on truth, strengthened by shared purpose, and dedicated to something larger than themselves. "More than ready," he replied, gathering their coats. The child they hoped to adopt represented everything they believed in: the possibility of healing, the importance of integrity, and the power of choosing to build something positive from life's hardest moments. As they drove toward the adoption agency, Blake reflected on the journey of the past 5 years. The scandal had caused institutional changes: stricter oversight of military family support programs, reformed pharmaceutical trial protocols, enhanced protections for deployed service members. But the personal changes were equally profound. Relationships strengthened by truth, careers redirected toward protecting others, lives rebuilt on foundations of integrity. The consequences of betrayal had played out exactly as Maurice had predicted. Dawn and Glenn's deception had cost them everything they'd tried to protect: careers, reputations, relationships. Dr. Burton's ethical violations had ended not just her career, but her entire professional identity. Each player in the drama had faced the natural results of their choices. But for Blake, Erica, and their circle of true friends, the aftermath had brought unexpected blessings. Their commitment to truth had created stronger institutions, deeper relationships, and opportunities to help others. The war at home had ended in victory, not through vengeance, but through unwavering dedication to integrity. As they pulled into the adoption agency's parking lot, Blake squeezed Erica's hand. "Ready to start our next chapter?" Her smile, warm, honest, loving, reflected everything their relationship stood for. "Always ready, Colonel. Always ready." The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. They had transformed betrayal into purpose, pain into protection for others, and loss into love. The war at home had ended long ago, but its lessons continued to guide them toward an ever brighter future built on the unshakable foundation of truth and honor. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.